The first body I ever saw up close wasn't one of the infected. It was my neighbor, Gerald Pruitt, 72 years old, face down in his irrigation ditch with a self-inflicted wound to the temple. 3 days before the national broadcast, 2 weeks before the grid went dark. He'd heard something on the shortwave, something the rest of us wouldn't learn for another 48 hours. And he decided, in whatever private arithmetic grief performs, that he'd rather not wait. I stood over him with my morning coffee still warm in my hand and thought, I'm not going to be Gerald. My name is Elliot Daines, 44, former defense contractor turned agricultural hermit, or that's the version I told people at the feed store in Harlan, Kentucky, when they asked why a man from Northern Virginia was buying a 160-acre tobacco farm with cash. The truth was simpler and uglier. I'd spent 11 years designing perimeter defense systems for embassies and forward operating bases. I'd seen what human beings do to each other when systems collapse. And I'd come to a conclusion most people reach only in fiction. The world was one bad Tuesday away from coming apart, and I intended to be ready. $2 million. That's what I spent turning the Pruitt farmstead purchased long before Gerald's final morning into something between a homestead and a military installation. The house itself was a 4-bedroom colonial, built in 1940, with good bones and a deep basement. I gutted it. Reinforced the exterior walls with steel-backed concrete panels hidden behind original clapboard siding. Replaced every window with ballistic-rated polycarbonate that looked, from the outside, like ordinary glass. The doors were custom steel cores with decorative wood facades, mag-locked from a central panel in the upstairs hallway. The basement became a supply vault. 14 months of freeze-dried food, medical supplies, water filtration, a battery bank charged by the solar array I disguised as a standard barn roof. Outside, the real work lived. A 12-foot perimeter fence, electrified, buried 2 feet into the ground to prevent tunneling, topped with razor concertina. Motion-activated floodlights on every corner. A network of ground vibration sensors I'd adapted from embassy tech, capable of detecting footfall patterns within 200 meters. Camera feeds routed to a monitor bank in the basement. 2 backup generators, diesel, with enough fuel for 6 months of continuous operation. A well with a hand pump backup. A greenhouse, root cellar. 3 shipping containers buried on the North 40, stocked as fallback caches. I had everything. That's what I told myself. That's what I told my daughter, Nora, 21, when she drove down from Lexington in her beat-up Subaru 3 days after Gerald died, and 6 hours after the first confirmed outbreak footage hit social media. She arrived with 2 suitcases and a look on her face that wasn't fear, not yet. It was the expression of someone revising their opinion of a parent they'd long considered eccentric. "You actually built it," she said, standing in the driveway, staring at what looked like an ordinary farmhouse. "I told you I was building it." "Dad, you told me a lot of things." She hauled a suitcase from the trunk. "Mom always said you'd either be vindicated or committed. I'm starting to think both." Her mother, Claire, my ex-wife, was in Portland. I'd called. No answer. I'd been calling every 4 hours since the first broadcast. Still no answer. Nora didn't ask about her. Not that first night. Not directly. She just looked at my phone every time I set it down, checking the screen like it might bloom with something other than silence. That night, we sat in the kitchen with the perimeter cameras glowing on a tablet between us, and I walked her through the systems. She listened. She asked smart questions. Nora had always been sharp. Sharper than me in most of the ways that mattered. Pre-med at the University of Kentucky. Steady hands. A clinical patience that could read as cold if you didn't know her. but I saw how her fingers tightened around her mug when the motion sensor chimed at 11:40 p.m. and the north camera showed 3 deer sprinting across the pasture like something behind them had teeth. "Just deer," I said. "Deer don't run like that at night," she replied. "Not unless something's driving them." She was right. I turned on the thermal overlay. The tree line was empty, but farther out, maybe 400 meters past the fence, there was a heat signature, human-shaped, stationary, just standing there in the dark at the edge of the tobacco field, facing the house. We watched it for 40 minutes. It never moved. Then, between one frame refresh and the next, it was gone. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a hiker, a lost traveler. Maybe someone from one of the neighboring farms looking for help. The rational explanations felt thin even as I assembled them. But I needed them not for me, but for the way Nora was watching me. If I showed alarm, she'd calibrate her fear to mine, and I needed her functional. The news was getting worse. The networks were still broadcasting, but the footage had a frantic quality, anchors visibly shaken, graphics hastily assembled. The infection, they were calling it Kessler syndrome, after the Johns Hopkins virologist who'd first identified the pathogen spread through fluid contact. Bites, scratches, blood exposure. The incubation period was erratic. Some turned in hours, others in days. The turned weren't dead. That distinction would matter later, legally and morally. But in those early days, it was academic. They were violent. They were fast. And they didn't respond to communication, pain, or restraint in any way that resembled human cognition. By day 3, I had the full perimeter electrified and running continuous. I'd tested every camera, every sensor, every lock. I ran Nora through the emergency protocols where the weapons were, how to activate the backup generators, which shipping container held what supplies. She absorbed it all with that pre-med focus. But I could tell she was doing what she always did, building a map of the situation to find what I'd overlooked. "What about people?" she asked on the 3rd afternoon while we were inventorying the medical supplies. "What about them?" "Your whole system is designed to keep things out. What happens when someone shows up who isn't infected? Someone who needs help?" "We assess, case by case." "Assess how? You've got a kill zone around this house, Dad. You've got a fence that would stop a vehicle. What's the protocol for a family with kids who just need water?" I didn't answer immediately, and she read the silence correctly. "You didn't plan for that," she said. Not accusatory, diagnostic. "I planned for survival." "Whose?" That conversation sat between us like a stone in a river, diverting everything that flowed after it. Because the next morning, someone did show up. His name was Marcus Reed, 36, former high school football coach from Everts, about 20 miles south. He arrived on foot, dehydrated, with a hunting rifle slung over one shoulder, and a 4-year-old girl named Lily asleep in his arms. His wife, he told us through the intercom at the front gate, had turned 2 days prior. He'd locked her in their bedroom. He'd taken Lily and walked north because someone in Everts had mentioned the fortified farm outside Harlan. I watched him on the camera. His face was drawn. His clothes were dirty but intact. No tears, no blood. Lily's face was pressed against his neck, and even on the grainy feed, I could see her fingers gripping his collar with the intensity of a child who'd learned that letting go meant losing. "No," I said. Nora was standing behind me. I felt her go still. "Dad." "We don't know him. We don't know if he's been exposed. The incubation period is... He has a child. That doesn't change the biology. Open the gate. We can quarantine them. The east barn, it's separate from the house. It's got a lock. We can observe for 72 hours. I looked at Marcus on the screen. He was swaying on his feet. Lily hadn't moved. The morning sun was catching the razor wire above them, turning it into a bright, cruel halo. I thought about Gerald Pruitt, about the arithmetic of deciding who deserves to survive. I opened the gate. Marcus cried when he walked through. Not loudly, just a quiet fracture in his composure that he tried to hide by shifting Lily higher on his shoulder. We directed him to the east barn via the intercom. I wasn't ready for face-to-face contact yet. Nora carried water and food to the barn door while I watched from the porch with the rifle I told myself was precautionary. 72 hours. That was our quarantine. If Marcus and Lily showed no symptoms, they could enter the house. On hour 41, Lily woke up screaming in the barn, and the sound carried across the yard, in the dark, like something tearing. Marcus's voice came through, gentle and broken, singing to her. Some song I didn't recognize. Nora stood at the kitchen window, listening. And when she looked at me, her expression had shifted into something I hadn't seen before. Not anger, judgment. The kind a daughter renders when she sees her father clearly for the first time and finds the picture incomplete. They passed quarantine. Marcus and Lily moved into the downstairs guest room. And just like that, my fortress designed for two held four. And every calculation I'd made about resource consumption, security protocols, and emotional architecture changed. Marcus was useful. I'll say that plainly because it mattered, and because it would be dishonest to pretend my assessment of him didn't begin with utility. He was strong, disciplined, and accustomed to managing people under pressure. A decade of coaching teenagers through fourth-quarter deficits had given him a specific kind of composure. He didn't panic. He followed instructions. And he had a quality I lacked entirely. He made Nora laugh, not often, not loudly. But in those first days after he cleared quarantine, I'd hear her voice from another room carrying a lighter register. And I'd know Marcus had said something that cracked the seal on whatever she was holding shut. It was small, and I tried not to resent it. Lily was another variable. 4 years old, dark-haired, enormous brown eyes that tracked every adult in the room with an alertness no child should possess. She didn't speak for the first 5 days. Marcus explained, quietly, while she slept, that she'd been in the house when her mother turned. She'd been in the closet. She'd heard everything. She talked before, he said. Full sentences, stories. She used to narrate everything. The dog, the birds, what she was drawing. Now she just... He opened his hands. Empty. I didn't know what to do with a traumatized child. My expertise was perimeters, concrete, sensor grids. The interior life of a 4-year-old was a system I had no schematics for. And I recognized in myself a dangerous impulse to categorize her as a liability rather than a person. Nora saw it. Nora always saw it. She's not a resource drain, Dad. She's a kid. I didn't say. You were calculating. I can hear it when you calculate. Your voice flattens. She was right. My voice did flatten. It was how I'd survived 11 years in defense contracting, by reducing human variables to logistics. Claire had named it during our marriage. She'd called it my operational mode, and she'd told me, the night she asked me to leave, that she couldn't spend another year living with a man who processed his family like a threat matrix. Nora had inherited Claire's directness without her patience. She simply assigned herself as Lily's caretaker and removed the child from my calculations entirely. Within a week, Lily was following Nora everywhere, to the greenhouse, to the water pump, to the upstairs hallway where the monitor bank glowed. Nora would explain things to her in a quiet, clinical voice, and Lily would watch with those enormous eyes, absorbing. On day 9, I was checking the eastern sensor array when the perimeter alarm sounded. Not the motion lights, but the ground vibration alert. Multiple signatures, moving in a loose cluster from the southeast, following the old county road that bordered the property. I was at the monitor bank in under a minute. Marcus was already there, standing behind the chair with his arms crossed, watching the thermal feed. 12 figures, moving at a pace that was wrong, too steady, too uniform, without the natural variation of a group walking together. People adjust to each other. They speed up, slow down, drift apart, reconverge. These figures moved like they were pulled by the same invisible string. Infected? Marcus asked. Probably. They're on the road. They might pass. They might. We watched. The cluster reached the point where the county road curved nearest to our fence, about 300 meters, and stopped. All 12, simultaneously, like a flock of birds changing direction in unison. Then they turned toward the property. They didn't run. They walked. That steady, wrong-paced walk, directly toward the eastern fence line, spread out in a loose arc. On the thermal feed, their signatures were slightly cooler than normal human body temperature. The infection did something to metabolic regulation, we'd heard, though the science was still emerging through increasingly fragmented broadcasts. Get Nora and Lily into the basement, I said. Marcus didn't argue. He moved. I watched the 12 figures approach the fence. The first one reached it and stopped. A woman, I thought, based on the build, though the thermal image was imprecise. She stood at the electrified fence for a long moment. Then she reached out and touched it. The charge should have dropped her. 1,200 volts pulsed, enough to incapacitate a grown man. She seized, stiffened, fell back, got up, reached for the fence again. The others arrived and did the same thing. One by one, they grabbed the electrified wire and held on until the current threw them back. Then they stood up and did it again. They weren't learning. They weren't adapting. They were simply enduring. And the battery bank powering the fence was draining with each discharge. My system was designed for deterrence, a brief, painful shock that would drive a rational actor away. These weren't rational actors. They were a problem I hadn't modeled. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of watching figures grab an electrified fence, fall, rise, and grab it again. The battery bank dropped to 60%, then 40%. At 32%, the charge weakened enough that the 8th or 9th contact no longer threw them back. They just held on and shook. At 21%, one of them pulled a section of wire free. I killed the fence power to preserve what remained in the battery bank. It was a triage decision. Keeping the cameras, the interior locks, and the floodlights running mattered more than a barrier that had already been compromised. The 12 figures pushed through the gap in the wire and crossed onto the property, and I met them with the only system I hadn't automated. Myself, standing on the porch roof with a scoped rifle and 60 rounds of .308. I won't describe what I did in detail. I'll say that I was accurate, that my training held, and that it took me 23 rounds to stop 12 bodies. The infected didn't drop easily. Center mass shots staggered them. Only headshots or catastrophic spinal hits put them down permanently. That was information the broadcasts hadn't made clear, that they'd talked about the infection, the violence, the spread. But the practical mechanics of stopping a turned human being were left to people like me to discover in real time. When it was over, I sat on the porch roof in the dark for a long time. The floodlights illuminated the yard in harsh white. 12 shapes lay scattered between the fence line and the house, like a diagram of failure. My fence's failure, my assumptions' failure, my belief that enough money and enough engineering could hold the world at bay. Marcus came out first. He stood below the porch and looked at the bodies without speaking. Then he said, "I'll get a tarp." We worked until dawn. We dragged the bodies to the far side of the north pasture and burned them in a pit I dug with the tractor. The smell was something I'll carry for the rest of my life, not because it was worse than what you'd imagine, but because it was exactly what you'd imagine. And knowing that your imagination had been accurate all along was its own kind of horror. Nora came out at first light with coffee. She looked at the burn pit, at the broken fence, at the brass casings I hadn't yet collected from the porch roof. 12, she said. 12. Next time it could be 50. I didn't answer because she wasn't asking a question. She was stating the conclusion I'd already reached, but hadn't been willing to voice. The fence was a finite resource. The batteries were finite. The ammunition was finite. Everything I'd built was designed for a siege mentality, hold the ground, outlast the threat. But the infected weren't an army that would deplete its supply lines and retreat. They were a tide. They didn't get discouraged. They didn't negotiate. They just kept coming. And every engagement cost me resources I couldn't replace. That afternoon, Marcus and I repaired the fence section. It took most of the day, and the work was physically brutal, heavy gauge wire, concrete set posts, all while scanning the tree line every 30 seconds. Marcus worked without complaint, which I appreciated, but he also worked with a deliberateness that told me he was thinking. "We need more people," he said, tightening a splice. "More people means more mouths. More people means more hands, more watch shifts, more labor for repairs. You can't run this place with 2 adults and expect to sleep." I ran it alone for 3 years. There wasn't anything trying to get in for 3 years. He set down the pliers and looked at me. His coach's voice surfaced, the one that was calm but didn't accommodate argument. "Elliot, I've been watching you. You haven't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since I got here. You're running on discipline and caffeine. That works for a week, maybe 2. After that, you start making mistakes. And out here, mistakes get people killed." He was right. I knew he was right. But admitting it meant accepting that my design, the entire philosophy of the fortress, was flawed. Not in its engineering, but in its premise. I'd built a system optimized for isolation. Every wall, every sensor, every lock was designed to keep the world out. What Marcus was describing was something else entirely. A community. And community required the one thing my defense contractor mind had always categorized as the greatest vulnerability: trust. That evening, the shortwave picked up a transmission. A woman's voice, tired but organized, broadcasting from somewhere south of Harlan. She identified herself as Dr. Amara Osi, said she was with a group of 11 survivors at a church outside Cranks Creek, and that they were running out of food. Nora heard it. Marcus heard it. Lily was asleep on the couch with her head in Nora's lap, and the room was quiet except for the static and that voice. 11 people, Marcus said. "We don't have room for 11 people. We have 160 acres. Room isn't just square footage. It's food, water, security. 11 people would cut our supply timeline in half. More than half we'd have to account for varying caloric needs, medical conditions, potential conflicts." "Dad?" Nora's voice was level. Her hand rested on Lily's hair. "She said they're running out of food. You know what that means." I did. It meant they'd start moving. and if they moved, they'd attract attention noise, heat signatures, visible movement on open roads. The infected tracked stimuli. A group of 11 on foot would be a beacon. If they come this direction looking for help and they bring a herd with them, I started. Then we bring them in before that happens, Nora finished. On our terms. I looked at the radio, at the static between transmissions, at the voice of a doctor I'd never met asking for help I'd never planned to give. I picked up the handset. Dr. Amara Osei arrived 2 days later, not with 11 people, but with 7. She'd lost 4 on the road. She said it simply, the way you describe whether it happened. It was bad. It's over. And I recognized in her voice the same operational flatness Nora had accused me of. The difference was that Amara wore hers as armor rather than architecture. She felt everything. She simply refused to let feelings slow her down. She was 48, Ghanaian-born, educated at Johns Hopkins. The irony of sharing an alma mater with the man who'd named the infection wasn't lost on her. She'd been practicing family medicine in Harlan for 6 years, which meant she knew the area, knew the people, and had already treated 2 bite victims before the infrastructure collapsed. Both had turned. Both had taught her things about the infection that the official broadcasts either didn't know or weren't saying. The incubation period isn't random. She told me that first night, after her group had been settled in the East Barn for quarantine. We were standing on the porch, watching the fence. It correlates with immune response. People with strong immune systems fight it longer, sometimes days. But they all turn eventually. Every single one. No exceptions? None that I've seen, and I've looked. She paused. There's something else. The turned, they're not mindless. Not completely. They retain spatial memory. A turned person will go back to places they knew, their home, their workplace, places with emotional significance. That reframed everything. It meant the infected weren't random wanderers, they were homing. They followed invisible maps written in the geography of their former lives. And Harlan County was small. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew this farm. How many people in the immediate area would know about this property? Amara asked. I thought about it. The feed store, the hardware store, the building contractors I'd hired for the reinforcements, most of them local, the county assessor, the postal carrier, Gerald Pruitt's family, neighbors along the county road. Dozens, I said. Maybe more. Then this farm is a waypoint. Every turned local with a memory of this place will eventually find their way here. Not because they're hunting you, because something in their degraded cognition is pulling them toward the familiar. I felt the ground shift under my assumptions. I'd built a fortress against a random, directionless threat. What Amara was describing was targeted. Not intelligent, not strategic, but patterned. Predictable in a way that made my perimeter a gathering point instead of a refuge. Her 7 survivors were a mix. There was Jonas, a 60-year-old mechanic with hands like engine blocks, and a quietness that felt earned rather than timid. His wife Bea was with him late 50s, a former school librarian who carried herself with the unshakable composure of a woman who'd spent decades managing chaos at a lower volume. There was a young couple, Tyler and Reese, mid-20s, who'd been camping in the Daniel Boone National Forest when the outbreak began, and had the disoriented look of people whose vacation had become an apocalypse. And there was a teenager named Dex 17, lanky, with earbuds still hanging around his neck, as if the music might come back any minute. He'd been one of Marcus's players, and when Marcus saw him come through the gate, something in his face collapsed and rebuilt itself in the same instant. "Coach," Dex said. and the word was so small and so full that Marcus just pulled him into a rough hug and held on. 7 new people, plus the 4 of us. 11 total, and my supply calculations, my water projections, my security rotations, all of it needed to be rebuilt from scratch. I stayed up that night with a notebook, redrawing the math, and the numbers were worse than I'd feared. 14 months of supplies for 2 had become roughly 5 months for 11, assuming strict rationing. The well could handle the demand, but the filtration system would need more frequent maintenance. The solar array was marginal for the expanded electrical load. The generators would burn through diesel faster. Every number told the same story. The fortress was a closed system, and I'd opened it. But watching Marcus with Dex the next morning, watching the kid eat powdered eggs like they were a 5-star meal while Marcus sat across from him, pretending to be calm while his eyes were wet, I understood something my spreadsheet couldn't calculate. Survival isn't an engineering problem, or it is. But the engineering is only the substrate. The actual survival, the thing that keeps a person from becoming Gerald Pruitt in an irrigation ditch, happens in the space between people. In the moments where someone knows your name and says it like it matters. I didn't have a formula for that. I was beginning to suspect that was the point. Quarantine passed without incident for all 7. On the morning they were cleared, I gathered everyone in the living room, 11 people, in a space designed for a family of 4 and laid out the rules. Water usage schedules, food rationing tiers, security rotation shifts, weapon access protocols, noise discipline, waste management, the greenhouse schedule, the communication procedures for the shortwave. They listened, some nodded. Tyler, the young camper, raised his hand like he was in class, and I almost told him he didn't need to do that. But something about the gesture, the instinct to find structure in chaos, stopped me. He asked about perimeter duty and whether he'd be trained on the rifles. Yes, I said. Everyone capable gets trained, no exceptions. B, Jonas's wife, spoke up from the back of the room where she'd wedged herself into a corner of the sofa with the deliberate invisibility of someone accustomed to observing. What about governance? Governance? Rules are fine, Elliot. But who decides when the rules change? Who settles disagreements? You've been running this place alone, and that's worked. But there are 11 of us now, and if you're the sole authority, that's not a community. That's a fiefdom. The room went quiet. I felt the familiar constriction in my chest, the one that surfaced whenever someone challenged my operational control. Claire's voice, distant. You process your family like a threat matrix. What are you proposing? I asked, keeping my voice level. Decisions that affect the group get discussed by the group. You have final say on security, that's your expertise. Amara has authority on medical matters. But resource allocation, admitting new people, long-term strategy, those are collective. Marcus was watching me. So was Nora. I could feel the weight of their attention, the question embedded in it. What kind of man are you when your walls aren't enough? Fine, I said. We'll try it. I didn't believe it would work. I want to be honest about that. I thought democracy in a survival situation was a luxury that would evaporate the first time a hard choice arrived. But I agreed because the alternative 11 people who resented me was a security risk I couldn't afford. The first week of expanded operations was chaos managed at a simmer. Jonas proved invaluable. He understood mechanical systems intuitively and took over generator maintenance without being asked. He also repaired the tractor's failing hydraulic line, which had been on my list for weeks. B organized the pantry with the systematic precision of a librarian cataloging a collection. And within 3 days, She'd created an inventory system that tracked every calorie, every medical supply, every round of ammunition, with a handwritten ledger that made my spreadsheet look amateurish. Tyler and Reese were eager but inexperienced. I put them on daytime perimeter patrols, low-risk, high-visibility work that would build their situational awareness without exposing them to real danger. Dex shadowed Marcus, absorbing everything with the focused attention of a teenager who'd found his footing in someone else's certainty. And Amara set up a medical station in the basement, converting a section of the supply vault into an examination area with a ruthless efficiency that suggested she'd triaged worse spaces. She conducted baseline health checks on everyone's blood pressure, pulse, existing conditions, medications. Jonas had hypertension managed by medication we had 8 months of. Tyler had a mild allergy to sulfa drugs. Lily was underweight. "She's not eating enough," Amara told me privately. "Stress anorexia in children her age is common after trauma. Nora's doing good work with her, but we need to monitor." What do? We give her stability, routine, predictable meals at predictable times with predictable people. Children regulate their nervous systems through environmental consistency. That's what she needs more than calories, the belief that tomorrow will look like today. It struck me as almost absurdly human advice in a world where tomorrow might bring another dozen infected at the fence. But Amara said it with such clinical certainty that I filed it alongside the ammunition counts and diesel reserves. Another variable in the equation of keeping people alive. On day 14 of the expanded group, the shortwave crackled with a new voice. Male, young, frightened. "Anyone out there, we're trapped. The school. Harlan Elementary. There are maybe 30 of them outside, and we can't please. If anyone can hear this." The transmission cut out. Static. Then again, louder. "There are kids here. 6 kids, please." 11 faces looked at me. And for the first time, the question wasn't whether we could afford to help. It was whether we could afford what it would cost us to not. The vote was 7-4. Marcus, Nora, Amara, Dex, Tyler, Reese, and B voted to attempt a rescue. Jonas, myself, and surprisingly the silent majority of my own logic voted against. Jonas abstained initially, then sided with caution when B gave him a look that said she'd made her choice and he was free to make his. He chose the other direction, the first crack in a 40-year marriage that I watched open in real time, quiet as a hairline fracture in load-bearing concrete. Nora cast the final vote while holding Lily on her hip, and the image wasn't lost on anyone. "We're going," she said. Not to me, to the room. Harlan Elementary was 11 miles southwest. Pre-outbreak, a 15-minute drive. Now, every mile was uncertain terrain, abandoned vehicles, potential infected clusters, road conditions unknown. I refused to send the group's entire combat capability, which meant a team of 4 at most. After argument, we settled on Marcus, Tyler, Amara, and myself. Marcus for his steadiness. Tyler because he'd been training hard and had something to prove, which could be either an asset or a hazard. Amara because the voice on the radio had mentioned kids and potential injuries. And me because the truck was mine. The weapons were mine. And no part of me was willing to send people into danger behind a plan I designed without being there to adapt it. Nora would run security at the farm with Jonas, B, Dex, and Reese. I spent 2 hours walking her through every system, every contingency, every override code. She listened with that pre-med patience and then said, "Dad, I've been watching you do this for 2 weeks. I know the systems. If the fence is breached, basement, maglocks, interior barricade protocol, I know. If someone shows up claiming to be uninfected, quarantine in the East Barn, 72-hour observation, no exceptions. Dad. She put her hand on my arm. The contact surprised us both. Come back. 2 words, the most she'd ever given me in the currency of vulnerability, and I spent them carefully, holding them in my chest as I climbed into the truck at 4 a.m. and pulled onto the county road in darkness. The drive was worse than I'd modeled. 3 miles out, we hit the first abandoned cluster, 8 or 9 vehicles tangled at the intersection of Route 38 and Mill Branch Road, some with doors open, some with dark stains on the upholstery visible in the headlights. Marcus guided me through a gap between a pickup truck and a minivan, his voice low and steady. And I thought, this is what he sounded like from the sideline. This calm certainty that the play would work if you just executed. At mile 6, Tyler spotted movement. 3 figures on the road shoulder, walking south. The wrong walk, that steady, synchronized gait I'd seen on the thermal cameras 2 weeks before. I killed the headlights and slowed. We passed within 40 feet of them. In the pre-dawn gray, I could see enough. A man in work coveralls, a woman in a nightgown, a teenager in a football jersey. Dex's teammate, maybe. Someone Marcus had coached. I didn't ask. Marcus was staring straight ahead with his jaw locked. And I understood the discipline required to look forward when the past was walking beside you in the dark. Harlan Elementary materialized out of the fog like something from a dream where you return to a place you'd forgotten. Single-story brick building, built in the 70s, surrounded by a chain-link fence that was decorative at best. The parking lot held 3 vehicles, and around the building's perimeter, visible even in the low light, there were infected, not 30. Amara counted from the truck as we idled 2 blocks away. 46. They stood in loose clusters near the doors, the windows, the loading dock. Some wandered in slow patterns. Others were motionless, faces turned toward the building as if listening to something inside. The radio said 30. Tyler whispered from the back seat. That was yesterday, Amara said. They accumulate. Memory draws them to familiar places, and a school is about as familiar as it gets in a small town. 46. I had 60 rounds of .308, a 12-gauge shotgun with 20 shells, and Marcus's hunting rifle with maybe 30 rounds, plus Tyler's handgun, against 46 infected who wouldn't stop unless you dropped them with a headshot. The math didn't work. And for the first time, I understood viscerally what Nora had been trying to tell me since the beginning. Some problems don't have engineering solutions. Some problems require you to be something other than prepared. They require you to be creative or brave or lucky. And I had spent $2 million and 3 years trying to eliminate the need for any of those. We need a distraction, Marcus said. Something to pull them away from the building long enough to get the people inside out. What kind of distraction pulls 46 infected? He looked at me. The loud kind. Marcus's plan was simple and reckless, and built on a coach's understanding of misdirection. We'd use the truck. Tyler would drive it in a wide loop around the school, horn blaring, headlights on, drawing the infected away from the south entrance. While the bulk of them pursued the truck, Marcus and I would breach the south door, make contact with the survivors inside, and move them to a secondary vehicle. There was a school bus in the back lot that Amara, positioned on a rooftop across the street with binoculars, confirmed still had its tires intact. Amara would provide oversight and radio coordination from elevation. And if the bus doesn't start? I asked. Then we're on foot with children, and we move north through the residential streets toward the creek bed. It's concealed. We follow it east until we hit the county road and loop back to the farm. That's 4 miles on foot. With a head start if Tyler does his job. Tyler, to his credit, didn't flinch. He gripped the steering wheel and said, "How long do I keep driving?" "Until we radio you to stop or until you run out of road. Stay ahead of them. Don't stop. If you get boxed in, abandon the truck and run north. You know the bearing to the farm." "I know it." I looked at Marcus. "This is a bad plan." "It's the only plan." He was right. I hated that he was right. We waited until the light improved enough to see clearly, then Tyler hit the horn. The sound was obscene in the morning quiet, a sustained blare that echoed off the school building and the surrounding houses. The effect on the infected was immediate and extraordinary. Every one of the 46 turned toward the truck. Not gradually. All at once, like iron filings responding to a magnet. Then they moved. Tyler drove slowly at first, letting them commit to the pursuit, pulling them south down the main road. In the rear-view mirror of my mind, I can still see the school bus yellow paint of the elementary's front door becoming visible as bodies peeled away from it. Dozens of figures flowing toward the sound with that terrible, synchronous gait. Marcus and I ran. The south entrance was a service door, steel locked. Marcus hit it with the breaching bar we'd brought, and the lock gave on the second strike. Inside, the school was dark, silent, and smelled like what happens when 8 people live in a building with no running water for 2 weeks. We found them in the cafeteria. 8 survivors, not 6 kids, as the radio had said. 4 children, ages 6 through 10, 2 women, 1 elderly man, and the voice from the radio, a 28-year-old teacher named Caleb Marsh. He was thinner than his voice had suggested. His glasses were taped at the bridge. His hands were shaking, and they hadn't stopped shaking, he told us later, for 9 days. "We heard the horn," he said. "Are they gone?" "For now. We have maybe 10 minutes. Is anyone injured? Infected? Bitten?" He shook his head, then stopped, looked at the elderly man sitting against the wall near the kitchen. Mr. Fenton was scratched 6 days ago by one of them. Through the window. "Amara, your doctor, she said on the radio that scratches count." I looked at Mr. Fenton. He was maybe 70, thin, with the resigned stillness of someone who'd already done his internal arithmetic. He looked back at me and shook his head once, slowly, not a denial, an instruction. "Leave me," he said. "No," Caleb said instantly. "We're not." "Boy, I was scratched 6 days ago. The fact that I haven't turned yet doesn't mean I won't. And if I turn in that man's truck with 4 children in the back seat..." The cafeteria went silent. The children, 4 small faces arranged in a row on a bench like an audience at the worst play ever staged, watched us with the unbearable patience of kids who've learned that adults argue before they act. Marcus keyed his radio. "Amara, scratch exposure, 6 days, no symptoms. Assessment?" A pause. Static. Then Amara's voice, clinical. 6 days is outside the observed maximum for conversion from a scratch. If he were going to turn, the window was 48 to 72 hours. He may have cleared the pathogen. I can't be certain without blood work. But statistically, he's likely clean. Mr. Fenton heard every word. His expression didn't change. "Likely," he repeated. "We're taking everyone," I said. It wasn't a decision I'd planned to make. It rose from somewhere below my calculations, from the place where Gerald Pruitt's face still floated in an irrigation ditch. "Bus, now, move." The bus started on the 3rd try. Marcus drove. I sat in the back with a shotgun, watching through the rear emergency door as the school receded. Tyler's horn was still audible to the south, growing fainter. The infected hadn't returned yet. We made it 4 blocks before we saw Tyler's truck. It was stopped at an intersection, driver's door open, engine running. No Tyler. Marcus slowed the bus. I scanned the street. Found him. He was on top of a parked SUV 40 yards away, surrounded by 9 infected who hadn't followed the main group. His handgun was in his hand, and from the way he was holding it close to his chest, barrel up, I could tell he was out of ammunition. "Stop the bus," I said. I told Marcus to keep the engine running and the doors closed. Told Caleb to keep the children down below the window line. Then I stepped off the bus with a shotgun and 60 feet of open road between me and a young man standing on an SUV who hadn't yet learned that bravery and survival rarely overlap. 9 infected. They were clustered around the base of the SUV, reaching upward with that mechanical persistence, arms extended, fingers grasping, bodies pressing against the vehicle's sides. Tyler was standing on the roof, balanced on the luggage rack, looking at me with an expression that combined terror and apology in equal measure. I fired the shotgun twice. The spread at that range was wide enough to stagger 3 of them, dropping 2. The sound pivoted the remaining 7 towards me, which was the intent, and also, in the clear light of retrospect, among the most frightening moments of my life. 7 infected, turning to face you at once is not something that becomes routine. Each time, the body registers it as novel danger, because some part of the animal brain understands that these shapes are human and wrong simultaneously, and that contradiction produces a fear that doesn't diminish with repetition. I fired again. Again. The shotgun was brutal at close range, and I used it to create space, not to kill, but to push them back, to break their focus, to buy seconds. Marcus appeared beside me. I hadn't heard him leave the bus. His hunting rifle cracked twice, precise, and 2 infected dropped with the finality that only a headshot provides. Tyler jumped from the SUV and ran. He reached us breathing in ragged sobs, and Marcus shoved him toward the bus without ceremony. We retreated. I put 2 more shells into the remaining cluster, and Marcus dropped another. The last 3 kept coming, and I let them close to 15 feet before the shotgun ended it. Silence. Then Tyler vomited on the curb, and the sound was so ordinary, so human, that it almost made me laugh. Almost. We drove. The bus lurched through Harlan's empty streets, past the feed store where I'd bought chicken wire and made small talk, past the Dairy Queen where the sign still advertised a Blizzard special, past the church where Amara's group had sheltered before finding us. Every landmark was a ghost of a world that had existed 3 weeks ago, and now existed only in the spatial memory of the infected who wandered its remains. Amara rejoined us at the rendezvous point, the Route 38 overpass, where she'd climbed down from her rooftop position and waited with her medical bag, and that practiced composure that I was beginning to understand wasn't calm at all, but a highly refined form of controlled terror. She checked everyone on the bus. Tyler's hands had shallow cuts from the SUV's luggage rack. The children were unharmed, but silent. A silence more profound than Lily's, collective and rehearsed. The silence of kids who'd been taught that sound meant death. Mr. Fenton's scratch had healed to a pink scar with no inflammation, no discoloration, no sign of infection. "You're clear," Amara told him, "as sure as I can be." He nodded, still that resigned stillness. "For now," he said. We reached the farm by mid-morning. Nora had the gate open and the east barn ready for quarantine. 19 people now. The supply calculations I'd rebuilt 2 weeks ago were already obsolete. 5 months of food for 11 had become roughly 3 months for 19. And that assumed the 4 children ate at reduced portions, which Amara immediately vetoed. Children eat full rations or they eat first, non-negotiable. I didn't argue. I was learning, slowly and painfully, that the things I couldn't negotiate were multiplying, and that each one made the fortress less mine and more ours, and that this transfer of ownership was either the salvation or the destruction of everything I'd built. That night, after the new arrivals were settled, after the quarantine protocols were established, after the children were fed and the watches were set and the fence was checked and the generators were fueled, I sat on the porch alone and did what I'd been avoiding. I called Claire. Not on the phone, the cell networks had been down for days. On the shortwave, broadcasting on the frequency we'd agreed on years ago during one of our arguments about my preparedness obsession. She'd humored me then, given me a frequency, rolled her eyes and said, "Fine, Elliot, if the world ends, I'll be on Channel 7. I broadcast for 20 minutes, gave coordinates, gave instructions, gave the things I should have said when we were married, but had processed into operational silence instead. The radio gave me nothing back. 3 weeks passed. In survival, 3 weeks is both an eternity and a blink long enough to establish rhythm, short enough that the rhythm still feels like a performance rather than a life. We fell into it. Jonas and Bea anchored the daily operations with a quiet authority that came from decades of partnership. Marcus ran security rotations, with the discipline of a practice schedule. Amara held clinic hours every morning in the basement. Caleb, the teacher, did what teachers do. He gathered the 5 children, including Lily, and created a school in the living room, teaching math with dried beans and reading from the small library I'd stocked as an afterthought, and now couldn't imagine the house without. Lily spoke on day 23 of the expanded group. Her first word in over a month was "again," directed at Caleb, who'd been reading a picture book about a bear. The room stopped. Marcus, who was cleaning his rifle at the kitchen table, went very still. Nora, standing in the doorway, pressed her hand against the frame as if she needed it for balance. "Again," Lily said. And Caleb turned back to page 1 with the careful gravity of a man who understood that this small word was a door opening onto a long, uncertain hallway. Mr. Fenton never turned. Amara monitored him daily, and his vitals remained stable, his cognition sharp, his temperament increasingly useful. He'd been a retired electrician, and he took over the solar array maintenance with a competence that freed me to focus on the perimeter, which needed constant attention now. The infected came in waves. Not the large clusters of the early days, but steady trickles 2 or 3 a night, drawn by whatever fragmented memory pulled them toward familiar terrain. We'd reinforce the fence with additional grounding to dissipate the charge impact. And I'd redesigned the power allocation to prioritize the electrified sections. But every engagement cost us something. Battery cycles, ammunition, sleep. The real cost, though, was psychological. Watch duty at night meant staring into darkness and waiting for shapes to materialize. And that waiting did things to people. Tyler developed a tremor in his left hand that he tried to hide. Reese stopped eating dinner, claiming she wasn't hungry, until Amara quietly intervened. Dex had nightmares that woke the house, and Marcus would sit with him in the hallway until the shaking stopped, talking in that low coach's voice about nothing in particular, plays, formations. The time Dex had fumbled a snap on the goal line and still scored. I was aware that I was changing too, but I lacked the vocabulary for it. Claire would have had the words. Nora tried. "You're softer," she said one evening, not as a compliment exactly, but as an observation, the way she might note a change in a patient's condition. Softer. You listened to B today, in the meeting, when she suggested rotating the greenhouse shifts. You listened. 3 weeks ago, you would have overruled her. She was right. She was right 3 weeks ago, too. You just couldn't hear it. I wanted to argue. Instead, I looked at the monitor bank, at the green glow of the perimeter cameras showing an empty field under a half moon. And I sighed slur. I admitted to myself that Nora was correct. The fortress had softened me by failing. Every breach, every limitation, every moment where my systems proved insufficient had forced me to turn toward the people around me instead of the walls. And in that turning, something had loosened in the mechanism I'd built inside my chest. On day 26, the shortwave picked up a military broadcast. Automated, repeating on a loop. Evacuation point established at the National Guard Armory in London, Kentucky, 60 miles north. Operational as of 5 days ago. Capacity limited. Bring identification. 19 people sat in the living room and listened to the loop play 3 times. Then the debate began. 60 miles, Jonas said. That's a full day's drive in good conditions. These aren't good conditions. It's the military, Tyler said, with the reflexive faith of someone who still believed in institutions. They'll have supplies, medicine, walls. They'll have walls that someone else controls, I said. And capacity is limited. They'll triage. Amara shook her head. They'll triage medically. They'll have equipment I don't have. Lab capacity to test for the pathogen. If anyone here is carrying a latent infection. The room tightened. No one's symptomatic, I said. Symptomatic isn't the same as uninfected. We've been operating on observation alone. A blood test could confirm or deny. For everyone's peace of mind. That matters. She was looking at Mr. Fenton when she said it, but her gaze swept the room. The implication was collective and unsettling. Any one of us could be carrying the pathogen without knowing. The quarantine protocols tested for visible symptoms. They couldn't test for what was invisible. We split, Marcus said. The room turned to him. Half go to London, half stay here. If the armory is real, the group that goes sends word back. If it's not, or if it's overrun, the farm is still standing. Who goes and who stays? B asked. Volunteers for both. No pressure. The division happened over 2 days of quiet conversations, private calculations, and the kind of soul-searching that doesn't look like anything from the outside. In the end, 9 would go. Tyler, Reese, Caleb, Mr. Fenton. 2 of the children whose families might be at the armory, and 3 others from Amara's original group. 10 would stay, myself, Nora, Marcus, Lily, Amara, Jonas, B, Dex, and 2 children with no one to look for. The night before departure, Caleb found me on the porch. I want to thank you, he said. Don't. You opened your gate. You drove into a town full of infected. You're giving us a truck and supplies for the road. I'm giving you a truck because I have 2, and I need the bus for capacity. He smiled. He was thin and knowing. You can frame it however you need to, Elliot. But I was in that cafeteria for 14 days. And I know what the decision to come get us cost you. Not in resources. In the part of yourself you had to override to do it. He left. I sat with his words like I'd sat with Nora's, turning them over, looking for the flaw, finding instead that the flaw was in my need to find one. They left at dawn. Tyler drove. Caleb rode shotgun with a road atlas and the shortwave tuned to the military frequency. I'd packed the truck with 3 days of food, water, medical supplies, a rifle, and 200 rounds. I stood at the gate and watched them pull onto the county road. And the distance between us grew with the steady finality of a tide going out. By noon, we'd received 2 check-in transmissions. By evening, 1 more. They'd made it 30 miles, bypassing 2 blocked highways and 1 cluster of infected that Caleb estimated at 60 or more. They detoured through back roads. Then the transmissions stopped. We waited. Nora sat by the radio through the night, turning the dial through frequencies, broadcasting requests for contact. Nothing. Marcus suggested interference weather, terrain, equipment malfunction. Jonas said the shortwave's range was limited, and they may simply have moved beyond it. All reasonable explanations, all insufficient to quiet the specific silence that lives inside a person who sent people into the unknown and lost their signal. On the second day of radio silence, I was repairing a sensor relay on the south fence when Dex came running from the house. "Elliot, cameras, west side." I followed him to the monitor bank. The western camera showed the pasture, the tree line beyond it, and emerging from the trees in a loose formation that was neither random nor tactical, a group of infected. I counted, stopped counting at 40, kept watching as more emerged. Amara's prediction had come true. They were homing. And something the noise of the truck departure, the increased activity of 19 people, or simply the accumulated draw of a familiar landmark, had brought them in numbers I'd never planned for. By the time the full group had emerged from the tree line, I counted over 80. They moved toward the western fence in that synchronized drift, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the first night. The vertigo of a system exceeding its design parameters. "That fence won't hold 80, Marcus said behind me. "I know. The battery bank is at 63% from last night's trickle." "I know. What do we do?" For the first time since I'd started building the fortress, I didn't have an answer rooted in engineering. Every contingency I'd designed assumed manageable numbers, 12, 24 at most. 80 was a different order of magnitude. The fence would slow them, the charge would drop some temporarily. But the math was identical to the first breach. They'd keep coming, the batteries would drain, and eventually the wire would give. I looked at the people in the room. Marcus, Nora, with Lily on her hip. Amara, already calculating medical scenarios. Jonas, steady as a bearing wall. B, her hand on Jonas's arm. Dex, trying to look brave and mostly succeeding. "We can't hold the perimeter," I said. "We fall back to the house, interior locks, basement if necessary, and we wait for them to disperse." "What if they don't disperse?" Amara asked. "They will. The homing instinct is temporary. You said that yourself. They cluster, they linger, they drift." I said that about small groups. 80 is a congregation. The density itself might sustain the behavior. They reinforce each other's patterns. Then we wait longer. With 10 people, 2 generators, and 3 months of food. The options narrowed as the infected reached the fence. I watched them on the monitors, the same behavior as before. Hands on electrified wire, seizure, fall, rise, repeat. But 80 hands depleted the charge faster than 12. The battery bank began dropping. 50%. 45. I shut down the fence at 38% to preserve core systems. The infected pushed through within minutes. 80 figures crossing my pasture in the afternoon light, walking toward the house with the patient inevitability of water finding the lowest point. We sealed the interior. Maglocks engaged on every door. Steel core barriers held. The ballistic windows were designed for bullet impact. Fingernails and fists wouldn't breach them. We moved the children to the basement. Amara organized supplies for a potential extended lockdown. And then we listened. 80 bodies pressing against the walls of my house. The sound was not what I'd expected, not the violent hammering of movie zombies, but a persistent, distributed pressure. Hands on surfaces, weight against doors. An ambient, continuous contact that translated through the steel and concrete as a low vibration, almost subsonic, that you felt in your teeth and your sternum. Lily pressed her hands against her ears. Nora held her. Marcus checked every window, every lock, every seal, the circuit of a man confirming what he already knew. The engineering held. For now. "How long?" Dex asked. Nobody answered. 31 hours. That's how long 80-some infected pressed against my house before the first ones began to drift. I know the exact duration because Jonas timed it on his watch with the methodical patience of a man who understood that knowing the number, even if the number was terrible, was better than not knowing. They didn't leave all at once. They peeled away in groups of 3 and 4, losing interest or responding to some stimulus we couldn't detect, wandering back toward the tree line or south toward the county road. By hour 31, the cameras showed perhaps 20 still clustered near the front porch. By hour 40, fewer than 10. By hour 44, the last one, a tall figure in a mechanic's jumpsuit that Jonas stared at for a long time without speaking, turned and walked east into the fading light. We emerged into a house that smelled like fear and confinement. The perimeter was destroyed. Not just the fence, the sensor relays, the floodlight mounts, the camera housings on the ground level. 80 bodies pressing and wandering for almost 2 days had scraped, bent, and broken things I'd designed to be unbreakable. The south porch railing was gone. The east wall's clapboard siding was scraped down to the concrete backing in long, parallel grooves that looked like the house had been mauled by something enormous. $2 million of fortification, and the walls had held. Barely. The infrastructure around them hadn't. "We can rebuild," Jonas said, surveying the damage with a professional eye. Fence is gone, wires torn in 6 places. Sensors are scrap. But the core structure is intact. House is solid. "The fence was the first line," I said. "Without it, we're relying on the house itself to stop them." The house stopped them. This time, Amara was moving through the group, checking vitals, assessing the psychological damage of 44 hours in a sealed box, with the dead pressing at the windows. Lily had regressed. She wasn't speaking again. And she'd started a rhythmic rocking that Amara identified as a self-soothing behavior that made my chest ache in a way no engineering problem ever had. Marcus pulled me aside that evening. His face was drawn, and the coach's composure had thinned to translucency. "We need to talk about leaving," he said. "Leaving? This farm. Elliot, I know what this place means to you. I know what you put into it. But we just survived a siege we can't sustain. If 80 came today, 150 come next month, or next week. The homing effect is accelerating. Amara thinks it's because the local infected population is growing. Every person who turned in Harlan County is a potential visitor to every familiar landmark in the area." "And go where?" "The armory. We haven't heard from the group in 4 days. Somewhere. Anywhere that isn't a known location to every infected person who ever drove past this farm or bought feed in town." "I spent $2 million. I know what you spent." His voice was gentle. That was worse than if he'd been angry. "But the money's gone, Elliot. It's been gone since the grid went down. What's left is the people inside that house. And they need you to be the guy who figures out the next move, not the guy who can't let go of the last one. I stood there, in the ruined perimeter of my fortress, and felt something I hadn't felt since Claire left. The specific grief of loving something that doesn't love you back. I had loved this place, loved the logic of it, the completeness, the illusion of control it provided. Every bolt, every wire, every poured footer had been an act of faith that preparation was enough, that walls were enough, that a sufficiently fortified position could hold against any force. But the force wasn't physics. It was biology. It was memory, the infected's and my own. I'd built a monument to the belief that isolation was safety. And the world had sent me people who proved the opposite. And then it had sent me a horde that proved the monument was a target. I need a day, I said. You have tonight, Marcus replied. Tomorrow, we plan. I spent that night alone in the basement, surrounded by the supplies I'd stockpiled with such care. And I dismantled myself. Not dramatically, not with tears or rage. Just a quiet, systematic disassembly of the identity I'd built around being the man with the plan. Because the plan had worked, technically. The walls held. The house stood. Nobody died. But I'd missed something. Something I couldn't have bought with $2 million or engineered with 11 years of defense contracting experience. And I was only beginning to understand what it was. We left the farm on a Tuesday. I remember that because B said, Tuesdays were always my errand day. And the mundane domesticity of it, the echo of a world where a day of the week meant grocery runs and dry cleaning made everyone smile in a way that hurt. The plan was Marcus's framework with my logistics. We'd take the bus and the remaining pickup, load essentials, food for 2 weeks, water, weapons, medical supplies, fuel. Leave the rest. Head north toward London and the armory, but cautiously, scouting ahead, ready to divert. If the armory was viable, we'd integrate. If not, we'd keep moving. The goal was distance from Harlan County and its population of memory-driven infected, get far enough away that no turned local would have reason to wander in our direction. I walked through the house one final time. The monitor bank was dark. I'd shut down the system to conserve the battery bank for whoever might come after us, if anyone did. The kitchen where Nora and Marcus had laughed over canned soup. The living room where Caleb had taught 5 children to read with dried beans. The basement where I'd sat in the dark and taken myself apart. I locked the front door. Steel core, maglock, decorative wood facade. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary farmhouse. That had always been the point. Nora was waiting by the bus. Lily was in her arms, face pressed against her shoulder. Marcus was doing a final check of the pickup. Jonas and B were already seated, Jonas with his watch and B with her ledger. Their proximity to each other repaired, not fully, not without the fracture line still visible, but functional. The way old partnerships survive isn't by pretending the break didn't happen, but by choosing to bear weight on it. Anyway, Dex climbed into the bus last. He looked at the farm through the window as we pulled away, and I saw him take out his earbuds and put them in, not connected to anything. Just the gesture, the muscle memory of a life where music existed. The drive north was slow. We moved in convoy, bus ahead, pickup trailing, rarely exceeding 30 miles per hour. The roads were worse than the trip to the school. More vehicles, more debris, more evidence of a collapse that had continued accelerating in the weeks we'd been fortified. We passed a gas station that had burned. A church with its doors standing open and dark stains on the front steps. A roadside memorial with fresh flowers, which meant someone alive had been here recently. and that small evidence of other survivors felt like finding water in a desert. At mile 22, we found Tyler's truck. It was on the shoulder of Highway 421, pulled over neatly, as if he'd simply decided to stop. The doors were closed. The supplies were intact. There was no blood, no damage, no sign of struggle. Marcus and I approached on foot while Amara kept the bus idling 200 yards back. The truck was empty. The keys were in the ignition. The shortwave was on, tuned to the military frequency, which was now broadcasting a different message. Armory at London compromised. Do not approach. Repeat. Armory at London compromised. Rally point relocated. Stand by for coordinates. No coordinates followed. Just the loop. Compromised. Do not approach. Stand by. Tyler and the others were gone. 9 people, including 4 children, had left this truck voluntarily. The neat parking, the closed doors, the intact supplies all suggested orderly departure, and walked into a landscape we couldn't read. Whether they'd been picked up by military, intercepted by another group, or simply decided to travel on foot was unknowable with the evidence available. Marcus picked up a folded piece of paper from the dashboard. Tyler's handwriting, messy and rushed. Armory overrun. Military pulled back. Met a convoy heading east toward Virginia. Took the chance. Couldn't reach you on radio. Left supplies. Sorry. T. Virginia. East. Away from us. Away from Kentucky's collapsing infrastructure and toward what? The coast? A different evacuation point? Hope dressed in geography? I took the supplies from the truck, added them to our inventory, left the truck where it was, keys in the ignition, in case someone else needed it. Then we drove on, north first, then east when the road allowed, following the ghost of Tyler's convoy because we had no better compass. And because east was where Claire was from, not Portland, that was where she'd moved after the divorce. But before that, before me, she'd grown up in the Shenandoah Valley. And some part of me, the part that built fortresses against the wrong threat, the part that loved in blueprints instead of words, thought that maybe, if she'd survived, she'd go home. The way the infected did. The way we all did. When the maps we'd drawn for ourselves burned and the only navigation left was memory. We drove for 3 days. East through the mountains, along routes that Marcus mapped with the atlas, and I confirmed with the compass. When the roads deviated from expectation, we encountered infected twice, a small group outside a rest stop that we drove past without stopping, and a lone figure on a mountain switchback that stood in the road and watched the bus approach with an expression I couldn't read from that distance and didn't want to read up close. Marcus steered around it. In the side mirror, it turned to follow our path but didn't pursue. The landscape changed. Kentucky's rolling hills gave way to Virginia's ridgelines, and the air felt different, thinner, cleaner, though that was probably imagination. We scavenged where we could. A pharmacy in a small town yielded antibiotics and bandages that Amara cataloged with quiet satisfaction. A hardware store provided tools and fasteners Jonas pocketed with the selectivity of a man who knew exactly what he'd need. We found fuel at an unlooted farm with a hand-pumped diesel tank, and the owner dead in the barn. 3 weeks at least. Not infected, just dead. The way people die when insulin runs out, had left his property unlocked, as if he'd known someone would come. On the 4th day, we reached the Shenandoah Valley. It was beautiful. That felt wrong. Beauty had no place in the logistics of survival, but the valley opened before us in the late afternoon light with a breadth and calm that made B gasp and Dex pull out his earbuds and just look. Green. So much green. The farms here were intact, not because the infection hadn't reached them. We could see distant smoke, abandoned vehicles, the markers of collapse, but because the land itself had a resilience that human infrastructure didn't. The fields grew without us. The rivers ran. The mountains held their shape against a sky that didn't care what walked beneath it. We found the house by accident, or I found it, because I'd been looking without admitting I was looking. A farmhouse on 40 acres outside a town called Churchville. White clapboard, red barn, a creek running along the eastern boundary, unfortified, unmodified. An ordinary house in an ordinary valley that had no steel-backed walls, no ballistic windows, no electrified fence, no sensor grid. Just 4 walls and a roof and a porch where someone had left a rocking chair. Marcus stopped the bus. We sat in the driveway and looked at it. No fence, Jonas observed. No, I said. No cameras, no locks worth mentioning. That front door's got a deadbolt that a strong kid could kick through. I know. So, what are we doing here? I looked at the house, at the valley around it, at the mountains that formed a natural bowl, limiting approach vectors better than any fence I could build, at the creek that provided water without a well, at the soil that B was already evaluating through the bus window with a gardener's hunger, at the open sight lines that meant we'd see anything coming from a mile away, which was better than any camera. Starting over, I said. Not from scratch. We had supplies, skills, people. But starting over in the way that mattered, without the illusion that a fortress could save us, without the $2 million worth of faith in walls. With, instead, the thing I'd missed. The thing that no amount of money or engineering could provide, and that every person on that bus had taught me whether they knew it or not. The house needed work. Of course it did. Jonas was already making a list. Marcus was planning security, not a fortress, but a warning system. Amara was identifying the room that would become the clinic. Nora was carrying Lily through the front door, and Lily was looking around with those enormous brown eyes. And she said quietly, so quietly that only Nora heard. And Nora told me later, she said, "Home?" And Nora said, "Yeah, I think so." There's a question people used to ask in the old world, the kind of hypothetical that passed for deep conversation at dinner parties. What would you do if civilization collapsed? I had an answer. I had a detailed, engineered, $2 million answer, and I was so certain of it that I built it into the earth with concrete and steel and razor wire. I missed one thing. Not a system, not a redundancy, not a structural component or a tactical contingency. I missed the fact that survival isn't a building. It's a verb, and verbs require subjects, plural, people. Flawed, hungry, frightened, inconvenient people who eat your food and challenge your authority and hold their daughters in barns while singing songs you don't recognize and make your own daughter laugh in a voice you'd forgotten she had. The farmhouse in the Shenandoah Valley has no fortifications. It has Jonas, who can fix anything. It has B, who can organize anything. It has Marcus, who can steady anyone. It has Amara, who can heal not everything, but enough. It has Dex, who is growing into someone none of us can predict. It has Lily, who spoke again, and keeps speaking more each day, narrating the world back into existence the way children do when they decide the world is safe enough to describe. And it has me, Elliot Danes, 44, former defense contractor, former fortress builder, current member of a community I didn't plan for, couldn't engineer, and can't control. I spent $2 million fortifying a farmhouse. The thing I missed cost nothing and was worth everything. I just had to lose the walls to find it.